Hello everybody, welcome to another chapter of Nature Unbound. Today we are starting Chapter 8, Diversity and Disturbance in Biological Communities. This is also the last chapter in our Nature Unbound book. So what does biodiversity mean? That's what we're going to talk about this in Part 1. In Part 2 we'll talk about disturbance. But what does biodiversity mean? We're going to simplify it a little bit by removing that prefix bio and just look at the word diversity. So how would you define diversity? And don't overcomplicate it. Give me just a simple dictionary definition of diversity in one sentence or less. Or you could do it in one word. Another word that means the same thing basically as diversity is variety. So diversity just means a bunch of different things. Look at these two baskets of fruit. Which one of these is more diverse? Well, instinctively you know that the one on the left is more diverse. But why? Well, it's because it has a larger variety of fruit in it. It's got oranges, grapes, apples, and bananas, compared to the one on the right, which just has oranges. Now, if I were to ask you which of these baskets has more fruit in it, it's probably the one on the right. It's just all one type. So biodiversity is not talking about the absolute number of things, but it's talking about the variety of different things. Let's add that prefix back in there, bio, and we are now talking about the diversity or the variety among living things. So let's take a look at a more scientific example. Suppose we have two forests. We have forest A on the left and forest B on the right. Each of these circles represents a different organism. The circles that are the same color represent a single species. So for instance, all of the blue circles are all members of the blue species. And we have a red species, an orange species, a yellow species, and which one did I miss? A green species. So we've got these two forests here. Which of these forests has greater biodiversity? Now you might have a guess, but wouldn't there be a nice way to somehow calculate biodiversity? Well, it turns out that there is. Let's start by just counting the different number of species that are in each of these forests. So keep in mind, these are the different colors. How many different colors, how many species are in forest A? How many different species are in forest B? Interesting, right? So they both have the same number of species. Does this mean that they have the same biodiversity? The number of species is what we call species richness. But this alone is not enough to calculate the biodiversity. We need another term, and this is the relative abundance. So the relative abundance is how often or how prevalent is a certain species within that ecosystem. So in this case, let's use the yellow circle as an example. So what's the relative abundance of the yellow circles in forest A? To calculate this, it's pretty straightforward. You would go to forest A, you would count all the yellow circles, and that would be 15, and you would divide that by 20, the total number of organisms. This gives you a relative abundance of 0.75. In forest B, you would do the same thing. You would count the number of yellow circles, which is 4, divided by the total number of organisms, that's 20, and this gives you a relative abundance of 0.2. All right, this is all good. It still doesn't tell us, it doesn't give us a single number to represent the biodiversity. And that is where the diversity index comes in. So scientists like to use a diversity index to measure the biodiversity within ecosystems. There are a number of different indices that scientists can use. I'm going to show you one of these. This is called the Shannon-Weiner Index. The Shannon-Weiner Index is represented here by this H prime. This is what we're trying to calculate. And in order to calculate this biodiversity index, you have to plug your numbers into this formula right here. It's negative the sum of p sub I times the natural log of p sub I. And I'm going to expect you to know this formula, be able to execute it flawlessly over and over again. Just kidding. This is not a math class. This is a biology class. And the cool thing about biology is that we really don't care that much about math. That's kind of true, actually. So for our purposes, I don't really care that you know how to use this formula. I just care that you know sort of what it's doing. So this formula takes the relative abundance of each species. That's what the P with the subscript I represents. That's the relative abundance of, let's say, the yellow species. And then it performs this calculation, and you do this for each species in your ecosystem, and you sum these results together. That's what this symbol represents. So you sum all those up, and then it spits out your diversity index. So let's go ahead and calculate the diversity index for forest A and for forest B to find out which one has a higher biodiversity. To do this, you're going to need a scrap piece of paper and the ability to count to 20. First, go ahead and draw this table. And label the top of the table Forest A and Forest B, and then mark the left-hand column with the different species names. In our case, they're just colors: red, orange, yellow, blue, and green. And then the bottom row, put that H prime. This is what we're trying to calculate. This is just represents the diversity index. In order to calculate the diversity index, all we need to do is count. So let's start with Forest A. We're going to count the number of each of the colors. So there's 1 red, 2 oranges, 15 yellows, 1 blue, and 1 green. Now take these numbers and plug them into this handy dandy online calculator, which I have linked to in the next question. And tell me, what is the Shannon-Weiner index for Forest A? On your own, do the same thing for Forest B. Count how many of each species there is, and then plug these into the online calculator and tell me what you find. So even though there's the same number of species in both of these forests, because there is more evenness in Forest B, it has a higher biodiversity index. So why do we care? Have you ever gone to the doctor and gotten a physical? What do they do there? First thing they do is they're going to take your vitals. So they're going to take like your blood pressure, they're going to listen to your heart and get your pulse, and of course they're going to take your temperature. Why do they do that? Well, it's because when you look at something like your temperature, we expect it to be at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And if your temperature is either high, or if it was too low, which almost never happens, then we know something is wrong. A diversity index performs the same exact function. So if you look at the biodiversity index for an ecosystem and you find that it's really low, then that could be a sign that something is wrong. So that's why understanding and being able to study the level of biodiversity in an ecosystem is really important. So what are some factors that affect biodiversity? There are 3 that are mentioned in the chapter, and you should know them. Number 1 is perhaps one that you don't think about first. This is latitude. What in the world is that? Well, if you look at the Earth, right through the middle of the Earth, that's our equator. And then you've got lines of latitude. The further you go away from the equator, either north or south, the higher your latitude gets. We here in St. Louis, we live at about 30 degrees north. So 30 degrees north of the equator. That's about a third of the way to the North Pole. As you move towards the equator, biodiversity increases. And the scientists don't know for sure why this is the case. Probably it has something to do with, well, there's more nutrients available there because there's more sunlight and typically more water. But there could be other factors involved as well. So as you move closer to the equator, biodiversity tends to increase. The second factor is habitat complexity. So compared to ecosystems, the one on the left has lots of variety. There's water, there's rocks, there's tall trees, there's bushes, there's small trees, there's grass. So lots of variety and complexity in this habitat. Think Amazon rainforest. Compare that one to the one on the right, which is just like an Arctic tundra. You've got snowy hills, pretty barren, just a few dense shrubs and ice floats that are out there. Not a lot of complexity in that habitat. And because of that, there's just not as much space to be filled in by a bunch of different species. So you can expect a higher biodiversity in a complex habitat than you would find in a simple habitat. Last but not least is area. So think islands. And this came up in your homework. A big island has more space, Similar to habitat complexity, there's more room there to support a larger number of species. So larger areas, you would expect to have more biodiversity compared to small islands where you would expect to have low biodiversity. Well, that's all well and good on this global perspective, but let's bring it closer to home. Here's Little Creek. Think about all the different habitats that you've seen at Little Creek, and then compare this to your school. So do you remember beginning of the semester how we compared the mammal biodiversity at Little Creek to the mammal biodiversity at your school? Which of these two quote-unquote ecosystems had higher mammal biodiversity? Yeah, Little Creek had a lot more mammals. So let's see why that might be by looking at those three factors which affect biodiversity. Latitude. Is there much difference in latitude? Not really. They're basically at the same latitude, which, as I mentioned before, is around 30 degrees north of the equator. What about habitat complexity? At McClure North, we typically have, well, a few trees, but mostly it's short grass that's cut. Not a lot of room there for a bunch of different species to thrive. Compare that to Little Creek, where we have a lot of the different habitats availability. There's a forest, there's lots of water in both the pond and the creek, and don't forget about the prairie with all that tall grass. So, of course, all of these factors make for much more complex habitats which support a larger number of species, and that was evident in our study. Even within Little Creek, there are different hot spots of biodiversity. Wherever different habitats meet, then you're going to have higher biodiversity. So for instance, where the prairie meets the forest edge, or down at the pond or the creek, so where the dry land meets water, at this edge there's tons of biodiversity. So you can see all sorts of different organisms. That's why actually we set up the trail cameras in the prairie and at the pond. By contrast, if you were to look smack dab in the middle of the forest, you're not going to see as much biodiversity because it's all kind of one ecosystem. There's not a lot of complexity there. It's more complex than a football field. So there still is a lot of biodiversity, but not as much as you find at these edges between habitats. And then last but not least, how does area play into it? The school property at McClure North is about 44 acres. That's actually pretty big. I was really surprised. Little Creek, on the other hand, is 100 acres, so that's over twice the size. So there's just more room there to build a large ecosystem with a high biodiversity. So this gives you a good overview on, number one, what biodiversity is. Number two, how species richness and relative abundance can be used to calculate a diversity index that describes the biodiversity within an ecosystem in a single number. You should also know why biodiversity is important and how it can be used to monitor the health of an ecosystem. And last of all, be familiar with the three factors we talked about that affect biodiversity all over the world and even in your own backyard.